Joining us now on the Goldberg New and Abraham Law Firm Hotline, Goldberg-Law.com, is Jason Cole. Been writing about the NFL for around 30 years. For the longest time, covered the Dolphins for the Sun Sentinel and the Miami Herald. You can follow Jason on Twitter at JasonCole62. Jason, first off, how are you and the family doing during all this? And thanks for your time.
First off, thanks for asking. We're doing fine. I mean, a little bored, but we'll be fine. I hope everybody's there is healthy, and appreciate a few moments.
Well, Jason, when we say Don Shula to you, what's the first things you think of?
Oh, I think of the press conferences. I think of the moments asking him questions and getting that sort of little growl that you would get from Don when he either liked something, or even if he didn't like something, or if he liked something. If he didn't like something, he'd really growl. If he liked something, he would kind of give this like growling, like acknowledgement, like, "Oh, you finally figured something out." He was. I really enjoyed covering Shula. I mean, we had our disagreements. I mean, and I covered him at his final 4 years, where there was a lot of pressure on him. Most of it self-imposed. He was trying desperately to win at the end of his career and take advantage of what they had left with Marino in those years, and start a free agency and sort of the changing landscape of the NFL. And they made an AFC Championship game in my first year, and I just think that it wasn't a pleasant finish for him. He didn't go out the way he wanted to go out, but I got to see him set the record for victories by a coach. I saw him do some amazing things like win games. With Steve DeBerg at quarterback, come in 1 week, win a game that week, win with Doug Peterson on the field, patch it together with Scott Mitchell, and of course, some amazing games with Marino at quarterback. So the full power of his ability to adapt and change was on display during that 4-year run.
Talking about Don Shula with Jason Cole. You can follow Jason on Twitter at JasonCole62. Can you take us back when you said there was a lot of pressure on Coach Shula at the end? I mean, his last 4 years, 92, they go to the AFC title game. 93, Marino blows out his Achilles. They go 9-7, but they miss the playoffs. 94, boy, they're close to an AFC championship game. They blow a big lead. Stoyanovich misses a kick late. They could have been in Pittsburgh that year playing for the AFC title, and they might have beat that Steelers team because the Chargers team that they lost
the day the lights went out in San Diego.
And then 95, they squeak into the playoffs, I think, with 9-7, and they get beat in the first round. I mean, it's not like, this was, heck, it's 4 winning seasons. It's 3 playoff appearances, and yet he was forced out. I mean, in retrospect, were the fans, Huizenga, was that just a collective screw up, or was it really time?
Oh, I would say it was really time. Don was, what was he, 66 at the time, if I'm remembering, 67. I mean, there were things that he wasn't, on top of. And look, one of the things that had happened is during the 13, 14 years that Marino and Shula were together, I think that there was, there's some edginess in that relationship too. Now, Marino loves Shula, and Marino learned a hard lesson trying to get along with Jimmy. And that's a whole different story that would take up way too much time. But I think that, Don had a lot of opportunities with Marino to win the Super Bowl and didn't get it done. And so, it was right on that edge, and I think that his message had gotten lost. Unfortunately, Jimmy, it ends up wasn't the right guy to bring in. But at the time, everybody in the world thought Jimmy was, and Jimmy was doing everything he could to get that job. So I don't look back at that and say, boy, they really screwed up by getting rid of him. I look back at it and say, there are some key things they didn't do along the way to take advantage of what they had. They didn't build the defense quite correctly enough. They didn't play a matching philosophy. If you want to put it on Shula, the biggest problem that they had is they're playing this high-paced offense, right, with Marino, and they're playing a bend but don't break defense. Well, those philosophies don't match up. So that's on Shula. That's on Shula to say, okay, we're going to play soft on defense and not try and force turnovers, even though we've got this quarterback who's amazing at taking advantage of opportunities if we can just get him more opportunities. It's sort of like what you saw with Sean Payton when he had Greg Williams in New Orleans. They played this aggressive defense. They didn't care so much about giving up points. They just wanted to steal possessions. The Dolphins should have been doing that. And if you talk to the coaches on that staff enough, they will tell you that they were playing a mismatched philosophy. And again, that's on Shula, even though I would just say he did some brilliant coaching along the way, because he was a brilliant coach.
Does Miami have the same I know you weren't there for the early years of the Dolphins, but without Shula, how different is football in the state of Florida? Because as we were just talking about, those 70s teams they did parades all over the state. They went to Jacksonville, they went to Orlando, and I have friends that are my age that live on this coast that their teams are the Dolphins and the Braves, because those were the pro teams that you could associate with for the longest time down here. So just how entwined is he, not just on that coast, but for football in the whole state, in your opinion, Jason?
Oh, I mean, he establishes a credibility for football and establishes pro football as opposed to college football being the biggest thing possible in the South, because certainly the Falcons didn't do it. The Falcons go into the NFL in, was it 66 or 67? I can't remember what year they were. And, and the Saints too. But the Saints and the Falcons are basically laughable organizations. And so they don't really capture the imagination of fans in the South. The Dolphins do. And at the time, Miami was still basically the South. I mean, geography aside, from a political standpoint, Miami is still the South. So it becomes the standard bearer. It's a standard bearer for the state of Florida. It's a standard bearer for football in the South. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, "Hey, we can play professional football down here. We can roll with the big boys down here." And you had a big boy coach, and and a team that went undefeated. So yeah, I think that just from a sports standpoint, they have a huge impact. From a geopolitical, I mean, we could spend hours talking about those championship years in the early 70s do to change the face of, the socio-political climate in Miami, in the aftermath of, the Cuban Revolution and everything, and what was going on in the city, right? Again, probably stuff that most sports fans don't really care about, but really important in the context of the history of the city, right? So in multiple ways, what Shula does down in Miami at that time has a huge rolling impact, which is why people fall in love with that team. In much the same way that people in Pittsburgh fell in love with the Steelers in the 70s, as the rest of the cities, falling into depression, the Steelers are the one thing that people had to be happy about. The Dolphins were the one thing in the early 70s that people had to have pride in this region. Especially when it came to professional football. So, yeah, his impact is endless.
Jason Cole has covered the NFL for around 30 years. You can follow Jason on Twitter at JasonCole62. When you talked to players on those teams that you covered when you talked to the coaching staff and from your own observations? What was it that made him a great coach?
Oh, look, Don. I referred to the growling at the beginning. Look, Don took no prisoners. Don was not afraid to stand up and rip you and demand better and better and better. And just when you thought you had given as much as you could, there was going to be more to be demanded. That was Don Shula. I mean, there's that famous quote that Joe Rose always goes back to. I think they're in the middle of going 8-8 in 1986, and it's the first time they've had, even I think a 500 record with Shula in Miami, and he's standing in front of the team in their old facility at St. Thomas College or St. Thomas University over in Miami Lakes. It was just a terrible venue. But he's standing in front of the team in that little classroom. And he goes, 8-8. I can go 8-8 with the guys from Carroll City. And he was referring to Carroll City High School. And so, like you say that in front of a room full of men who are football players, that doesn't exactly play well. So, he was not afraid to snarl at people on a pretty constant basis, whether you were a reporter or whether you played for him.
It's something about, because Don's wasn't the biggest man in the world, but it's something about that growl. I remember as a kid sneaking in a back door of a Michigan practice and watching Bo Schembechler undress this 300-pound lineman, and it seemed as if Schembechler kept growing and the lineman kept shrinking. And I kind of have that same thought about Coach Shula, because as we talked earlier in the show, the last time we had him on, David asked one of those questions that got the growl response. And me asking the next question, I'm petrified because he's giving David the growl, and I'm going, if you don't ask something good here, you're going to really get it.
Right.
And he scared the crap out of you, but it was okay.
I love that, though. I mean, to me, that was that's the essence of his personality. Don't you want? I would want to see more of that. I mean, yeah, it was fear-inducing, and I'm not sure exactly why. Because he wasn't a big man, and I didn't fear him physically, but boy, he was not afraid to rip anybody. I mean, anybody. I mean, he was just.
Do you have a favorite press? Do you have a favorite press conference story of Coach Shula?
Favorite press conference story was Shula,
and maybe it involved you.
No, because the tone of them wasn't. Yeah, let me say this: Shula was better after losses, because there was a humility to him, and he was much better just being sort of laying it out there, okay, we weren't good enough, and here's ask what you need to ask because I have we lost and I have no defense. He didn't make excuses. If there's one moment. God, they're just. I mean, they all kind of blend together. Of this, and let's say this: he wasn't always interesting in those press conferences. He would always start the post-game press conferences by just reciting everything that just happened in the game, and so you had to push him. I think the one where I made him uncomfortable, and I didn't mean to. But I had to ask this factual question. They had to go to Indianapolis for a game. I think it was in the '94 season. And the way the standings worked out, they were down to, there was a lot of tiebreakers in place, right? About where they, and one of the tiebreakers that was in play was they had to win, not only win, but they had to win by as many points as possible. Because the point differential tiebreaker had a very high potential to come into play.
Right.
And I had to ask about that. I said, Coach, you not only have to go there, you have to go to Indy to try and win, but you have to try and win by as many points as possible because this is the way. And oh boy, he did not enjoy that question. And he's like, "What do you mean? What are you talking?" I'm like, "Well, this is the rule." And he eventually had to kind of like admit, well, that's the rule. But he didn't want to talk about it because he didn't want Ted Marchibroda to put up on his. He knew what Marchibroda was going to do, which was Marchibroda was going to take this article and he was going to put it up on the blackboard,
right?
Yeah, right, and say they're going to try and embarrass us. And it's not that. It's just these were the rules, right? And boy, he gave me these like it was one of these ones where he was really angry that I brought it up, but he couldn't dismiss me because he knew I was right, and it was just it made for a very, very uncomfortable conversation where he just didn't even get to yell at me. He pulled me aside privately a couple of times, and he let me have it over some other things, and I would have to either I would fold, which happened a couple of times, or I would have to try and bow up because he was basically challenging me in those times, in those moments.
Finally, Jason, though, from everything that I heard yesterday, but also had heard over the years, he was tough, but everybody said he was fair. Did you agree with that?
1,000%. 1,000. I mean, he didn't play favorites. Look, he had his reporters that he got along with better. I mean, Edwin Pope, from the Herald, he got along with. There's no question about it. And there were some other guys, Larry Dorman, who had covered the team for many years, Andy Cohen, who covered the team for the Sun Sentinel and eventually started the Dolphins magazine. There were a bunch of reporters that he got along with, but there's nobody he called to plant stories. And if you had something, he answered. Like, he didn't hide it. He didn't try and, he didn't use information as a weapon. And in this day and age, people use information as a weapon to get the media to fall in line, right?
Absolutely.
He never believed in doing that. And I had great appreciation for that. Because, I had to cover the final 4 years. I didn't get to cover the heyday. I got to cover the years where people were expecting that they were finally going to win a championship, and where people were saying, did you ask the question, did you waste the Marino years? And that was tough for him. That was not easy. So I covered the end game of one of the giants of the game, and it did not make for a lot of pleasant coverage. Let's just put it that way.
He's Jason Cole. Follow him on Twitter at JasonCole62. Jason, thanks for agreeing to do this. And like we said at the beginning, we hope you and your family are safe and well.
Likewise. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Jason Cole, kind enough to join us here on Miller and Moulton. Mark, two of the media members that Jason mentioned were actually responsible for getting Don Shula the job. Joe Robbie was looking for a coach, and it was Edwin Pope who said to Joe Robbie, well, you should hire Shula. And Joe Robbie didn't know him. And there was a writer there who had gone to college with Shula. And so he said, well, I know him. I got his number. And so between a sports writer telling Joe Robbie who he should hire and a sports writer acting as the go-between originally to, get the two of them to talking, the media was actually, in a way, responsible for bringing Shula to Miami.
Do you think he had Shula's home number or his cell?
I'm guessing that was a big rotary phone. A big rotary phone. And the only question was it up on the wall or was it sitting on a table?
Wall.
Wall
kitchen.
Also.
Wall kitchen in Baltimore.